We are ready.
I want to show you something, a couple things, a few things that are actually really special to me. Now, you probably have something like this. I almost guarantee it. I have the photos, I have the things here, and Agata has images there. So I'm just going to put these up here. These are 3 of my grandparents. My mom's parents and my dad's dad. Now, these are actually pretty much, in my case, the only thing that I have from them. This picture of my grandfather, I've had for several years, probably actually since I was in university. I had that one. And then a few years ago, I realized, wait, I've only got like the one grandparent. So I wrote to my mom and I said, hey, can you get me a copy of your dad, Grandpa, and so I can have that? And I said, just send me a copy. So she sent me the original. So this is actually taken back, I think, in the 80s. I think it was probably the last photo that they had taken together. My grandmother died in 88 from Alzheimer's, but she was in the hospital from about 82, and she broke her pelvis and all these kind of stuff. So these are sort of the only things that I sort of have left. Now, when I look at these pictures and I see them, or I see the pictures that my parents have on their wall, they have a whole wall of photos at their house. I look at these photos and I think about them. Now, I knew 2. I knew my grandfathers, but I never really knew my grandmother. But I look at them all, and I wonder, and I think about, what were they like before I knew them? Right? Because I didn't know them their entire lives. I only knew, 20, 30 years for 2 of them. My other grandmother, who's missing from my photos, she died when I was 1. So I never knew her. And my grandmother, she had Alzheimer's since the mid-60s. I was born after that. I'm not that old. And so I don't even know her. In fact, my only ever interaction that I can remember that she and I actually had, if you can call it that, we were at my grandparents' house, and my mom had asked me to go. I was early. I don't know if I was 10 yet. My mom had asked me, I guess I wouldn't have been, my mom had asked me to go to the kitchen and check on something in the oven, which I was capable of doing. My mom started teaching me to cook when I was 7. So I went to look at something, but my grandmother saw me and grabbed me and was holding me back. So here I am, I got one hand on the oven door and one hand being held by my grandmother, whom I've never actually had a conversation with whatsoever. Mom! That's the only interaction that I ever actually had with that grandmother. So because of that sort of thing, and because I didn't know my grandparents for as long as they were alive, I only knew them the portion of life that I was alive, I'm actually quite reliant on my parents to tell me what my grandparents were like. I was fortunate enough to spend quite a bit of time with my Grandpa Veers, my mom's dad. We did some trips together, and it's kind of funny the number of times that I actually find myself quoting things that he said. And some of the times I didn't even hear it directly from him. I'd hear it from my dad, or I'd hear it from my mom, and that became sort of what almost a tradition. So my kids will now hear me, and my wife, she'll hear me say stuff like that as well. So we're sort of reliant on these things. But we have these things that are really precious to us and help us remember people. Sometimes you might have something else. Maybe you have a photo. I actually have another photo here too. I asked Renata to lend me her photo because this is a really, really special photo for her. You can see it in the middle. Oh, perfect framing. Good, there we go. This is a really special photo for her. She keeps this by her bedside. It's just probably about the most special photo you have, right? No, I'm starting to cry. Okay. These are really, really special things. Now, if you think through your own life, some of you are fortunate enough that you actually have something, maybe from a grandparent, an uncle, an aunt, a great-grandparent. I never knew mine. Mine were all dead before I was born. But, can you think of it for a second? In fact, maybe tell me, is there something you have, like, I don't know, a compass, a watch, a tie, something like that? What do you have? Anybody? Nobody has anything?
A sweater that my grandma made for me.
A sweater that your grandmother made. There you go, yeah. Grandma, ooh, careful with that one.
My grandmother made me a Christmas stocking when I was an infant.
A Christmas stocking when you were an infant.
My great-great-grandfather's porcelain cow.
That sounds very English. A porcelain cow. But the English keep it.
I borrowed my dad's shirt when I was 16, and I still have it.
Still got it. Does he know?
No.
He still doesn't know. So we've got all these sort of things that we look at, and they help us remember somebody or maybe something in the past. Now, for a lot of us too, for many of us in the room, from the countries we come to, there's another sort of collective remembrance that we have, and it kind of looks like this. It's from the First World War. These are poppies. Poppies in the First World War, with the front being so churned up, poppies were actually one of the only things that would grow in the churned up soil. And because they were so profligate, they were everywhere, this became the identity, the sort of symbol, the representation of the war dead in the First World War, and then it's become a remembrance, a representation of other ones. So on Remembrance Day or Armistice Day, we might wear something kind of like this. In Canada, we have the sort of plastic pins that we put on, and everybody will wear one of these things to remember others that have gone before us, the things that they have done, the sacrifices that they have made in order that we might have what we have and live the way that we live. So it's sort of a collective remembrance that we look back on. Now, every one of us, if we choose, also has been given a remembrance of some sort. In fact, one thing too, I mean, when you look at these sort of things, the things that you have, the porcelain cow, the T-shirt, whatever, even the stocking there, all these sort of things, our memories aren't always reliable, and sometimes you wonder, okay, did that actually happen? But because we have these material things, they actually help us remember. They reassure us that the past or something in the past actually did happen. And if remembering the past can actually help us cope with the present. So like I said, every one of us has been given a remembrance of someone and something incredible too, if you choose to acknowledge it. But the story started way back. So we're going to go back a little bit. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I'll sort of give you where it started. You have to go back about 3,500 years, for 3,500 years. I'm not going to give you all the backstory. You can go back to Genesis 39 or go earlier and read in to how these people got to a land named land of Egypt. And these were the Hebrews, and they were there. And they had gone from simply guests or occupants of the land. Now they're actually in slavery. So they're living here, and maybe you've seen the movie Prince of Egypt or 10 Commandments, and you got this guy Moses that comes along. And Moses, he's been raised in the royal household, but he's, sort of taken off because he killed a guy and was afraid for his life, and he goes off, and God meets him in the desert and says, hey, I want you to go back, and I want you to lead my people to freedom. He's like, but I don't really speak well. Actually, I learned a lot about the speak well this week. He probably spoke really well. He just didn't think he was as good as most of the Egyptians with the rhetoric that was actually really, really valuable to them. He didn't really want to go, but he eventually went. So he goes to Pharaoh, and continually he goes to Pharaoh, and God's given him signs to show Pharaoh, to convince him, yeah, God's the real thing. You should listen to him, and you should let these people go. So you go through all these plagues. Famine, locusts, flies, frogs, all these different things. And Pharaoh continually says, okay, just get rid of those things, and then I'll let you people go. They're like, okay. God's like, all those things are gone. And Pharaoh's like, you know what? I changed my mind. I'm not going to let you go after all. So this goes on and on for about 10 times, 9 times, and finally, God says this. It says, okay, it is time to let you go. I've shown my power. I've shown that I'm the real thing. So now, in order to reestablish my right to be the giver of life and also the taker of life, every house in Egypt will lose its firstborn. Now, while this is happening, God also tells the Hebrews, he says, this is what you need to do. In order to mark yourself different from the Egyptians, I want you to do this. We're going to have a special meal. You're going to have lamb, you're going to have some other stuff, you're going to have unleavened bread, you're going to have a few other things that became part of the meal that they would continue to eat for years to come. But one of the things that they were supposed to do was to take the blood of the lamb and actually mark their doorway, sort of the sides and the top, that kind of thing. Because their blood would show that that house is under the covenant between God and the nation of Israel, which wasn't really a nation yet, but the people of Hebrew, the Hebrews. In ancient times, because that sounds really kind of gross to some of us, like blood, ew, right? But in ancient times, blood was how contracts were ratified. Even if you were to go back and look at God and Abraham, you look through there and it's like, okay, blood is what ratified the contract, but the promise that God had made to the covenants that God had made with Abraham. So it wasn't really that strange to the ancient Middle Eastern, Near Eastern world. So, but that's what they would do, and they put the blood there and show that they were actually covered by the covenant. Now, the Passover itself, that word refers to the angel of death passing over those houses that were marked with the blood that showed the blood of the lamb that showed that they were actually covered by the covenant. So the Passover meal itself, they'd have the lamb, they'd have unleavened bread, they ended up having some bitter herbs and some different things that were part of it. Wine became a part of it. I don't know if it was part of it at this point especially, but it became part of it later on, certainly by the next stage that we're going to talk about in a few moments. And they take these bitter herbs and they dip them in a fruit, nut, and vinegar concoction to sort of get rid of some of the bitterness, and the bitterness would come to represent the suffering of the nation as they went through. But this celebration of Passover, as it would become, looking back to this moment that God would pass over, that the angel of death would pass over with God preventing death in that household, was a celebration of God delivering his people. So you fast forward about 1,500 years, roughly, and you come to Jesus. And now Jesus, it's time for the Passover, and they would have had, it was proper to have the Passover in Jerusalem. And we actually probably have a decent idea where in Jerusalem it was, but that's sort of the whole geek stuff, so I'll leave you alone on that one. I won't tell you all that kind of stuff. It's really fascinating to me, but you know. So they're in Jerusalem having this thing. Jerusalem's just jam-packed with people because this is where you go to have the Passover, right? So whatever population it was, multiply that by several. Everything is full. Everything is jammed up. And so Jesus and his disciples, they have this upper room, which is a significant thing in terms of the wealth of the family that owned the house. So they're upstairs and they're doing this. They're having their, probably in quite a cramped room, and probably just the 12 and Jesus at this point, because there really wasn't room for 120 or more, like that sort of thing. So they're all there and they're all really tight and they're in these quarters and they're having this meal here. While they were eating, Jesus took bread, and after giving thanks, he broke it. He gave it to his disciples and said, "Take, eat. This is my body." Now stop there for a second. The Passover is highly, highly prescribed. In fact, last year, I think it was before Easter, I went online and I found, is a Yemeni Jew, I forget there's titles for that for them. And he was going through step by step how you must follow the Passover. What's the proper way of doing it? And giving every instruction. You can do this if you do this, but you can't do it if you do this. And then after you say this, then you must do this, and you have to do it this way. You have to wipe, or you have to eat, or it's really, really prescribed. Everything that's said during Passover is really, really prescribed. But here's Jesus, and he's like going off script. It's like, Jesus, what are you doing? It's like Jesus, he's taking this moment that's a celebration of the previous 1,500 years, looking back to something 1,500 years ago, but looking at all that God has brought them through as well, through exile and to Babylon and Persia and all these sort of things. God's faithfulness through all this time. They had this celebration that they would continue to look at, and here they are looking back at 1,500 years of history, and here's Jesus sort of turning it around. And he's beginning to turn it towards himself. He says, he broke the bread and gave thanks. Well, he give thanks. He's not really blessing the food there, but he's giving thanks for what God has done, giving thanks for this meal. And Jesus begins to turn their thanks and celebration and observation actually to himself. Now, the disciples at this point probably had no idea what was going on. They probably had no idea what Jesus was actually saying at this point. You may be thinking, Peter, he's over here angry because Jesus is still talking about himself being killed. You get Thomas maybe at the other end of the table thinking, what's going on? And then you got Judas wondering, how much does he know? Has he figured it out yet? He's over there. right? They didn't really get this because Jesus is telling them about something he's about to do, and their mind is locked into what's already happened, especially in this moment when you're talking about a Passover, which is about the previous 1,500 years. So they're like, it's always one of my favorite episodes of Star Trek, the original series. I forget, Mudd's planet, and you got all like, does not compute, and all the heads start popping off. That's the sort of what I imagine every time Jesus does this kind of stuff with his disciples. Their heads just start popping off, and they go frozen. Now, just aside here, nobody would have thought that when Jesus is looking at the bread and the wine that we're about to come to in a second, nobody there would have expected that Jesus meant these things literally. They never would have expected that Jesus meant literally, this is my body. Literally, this is my blood. Because when they look at the bread of the Passover, and they'd have this very, very specific thing that they would say this in the Passover: this is the bread of affliction our ancestors ate when they came from Egypt. They didn't look at the bread and think, wow, this is really old bread. It's 1,300, 1,500 years old. They're not looking at it thinking that, right? It's a literary thing. One of the other things, too, is that you've seen, as you'll go through the New Testament, you see John do this. John actually proclaims it when he sees Jesus very, very early on. Jesus is called the Lamb of God, which is significant given the whole Passover. And this is what Jesus is beginning to cast in on himself. Now, I think we can keep going from there. After taking the cup and giving thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood, the blood of the covenant." And again, he didn't mean it literally. This is not how they would have understood it. But there's that word covenant. There's that promise again. This promise that he'd given to Abraham, and he continued to give it to his people through the years. And now Jesus is saying, pointing back at something that the prophet Jeremiah, several hundred years before, points to and says, there will be a new covenant. God will establish a new covenant with you. And here is what Jesus is referring to. So 1,000+ years of history and redemption now brought to culmination in this event. Because this is what's happening here. Passover celebration up to this point was a celebration, it was remembering the Exodus, leaving Egypt, and became a focus for Israel's memory of its past and hopes for its future. Passover was an act, and here it is, of remembrance and expectation, anticipation of what's to come. Because that's how it's changing here. Now, in the church nowadays, and we don't really use this word, but it's a significant word, and we can operate off of this word, is the word called a sacrament. Ever heard of the word sacrament? Anybody? Okay. That word itself refers to a number of different things, and there's discussions, with Protestants and Catholics, what is a sacrament? How many are there? How do you do them? All these kind of things. But we think of, I can think of three specifically that tend to be the most common. One is marriage, wedding, that kind of marriage. Baptism is another really big one. But then one that's really big is communion, or the Eucharist, or the Lord's Supper, whatever tradition you come from, that you come out of that. Now, the word sacrament itself, actually from the Latin sacramentum, which meant sacred oath. And then now Tertullian, you don't have to know who he is. He was a guy in the 3rd century, in the 200s. He actually looked at this and used that analogy as referring to demonstrate the importance of the sacraments in the church, our loyalty and commitment to the church and to Christ and all that sort of thing. So he takes that. But what really the important thing here is too is when you look at these different sacraments are signs of God's promises, because really they are anticipations of our future. They connect the past, the present, and the future all in. Now, when we look at these sort of things, you wonder, okay, what's going on here? And I think the tendency for a lot of people is to think that this is just purely a spiritual thing. And we're not really going to focus in terms of, sort of what's going on in this, what's the presence of Jesus, or, what's really happening. We're not going to talk about that this morning. Our primary focus today is simply, why are we doing what we're doing? But they're more than just the spiritual things. We like to divide things into, sacred and secular, into sort of spiritual and non-spiritual. But it's too clean. You can't do it because nothing is purely one or the other. But these are more than spiritual realities. These are an important corrective for our tendency to do what I just said, which is to separate, to begin to think of our life of faith in purely spiritual terms. We get nervous talking about the non-spiritual, but the reality is that, and I can show you a scripture to back this up, the reality is that the world can lead us away from God. Although I think actually it's never really the world leading us away from God, it's us leading ourselves away from God in order to worship something else. It's not because, the devil made me do it. Oh, this person made me do it. Oh, it was just too tempting or whatever it was. No. You wanted to worship something else. You're the one who led yourself away. But at the same time, the world, the universe, the cosmos, everything in it, the material world, can actually lead us to God. In fact, there's a lot of people that's in fact exactly how they came towards God. They moved towards him because of what they saw in creation. And because of that, they moved to him. C.S. Lewis said this: God never meant man to be a purely spiritual creature. That is why he uses material things like bread and wine and put the new life into us. We may think this rather crude and unspiritual. God does not. He invented eating, which I'm glad for. He likes matter. He invented it. Sacraments are given in material form because we need physical reminders of God's spiritual promises. So the Eucharist, and the word Eucharist itself, if that's the term that you maybe grew up with, I was going to ask Vesna what it is and what the Orthodox use for it. I don't know. It actually means to give thanks. That's what the word Eucharist means. Now, this commemoration now, as you're seeing, I just showed you the history of this thing. This is a commemoration that's been handed down to us for 3,500 years. Now, it did change, but it started 3,500 years ago. The Passover celebration itself, before Jesus was celebrating it, looked back at what God had done, but it also looked forward to what he would do, which came true in the words of prophet Jeremiah, and Jesus began to point towards himself. But then the Lord's Supper, Jesus is here. He takes this same thing and he updates what it's celebrating. Because what they had been celebrating up to that point came to a completion. It was done. It's going to move on from here now. It looked to what God has done for us, but also what he will continue to do for us in a new way through Jesus. It looks back. It looks forward to the future. And we hold those, and this is the tricky part, we hold those in tension now. The now and not yet. We don't like that tension. We want to resolve tension, right? It's like, let's just focus on the now, or let's focus on the not yet. One or the other. But no. It's both at the same time. Several traditions and understanding of what's going on in these sort of things, that's not the important thing this morning. We can talk about those things. Those are good to talk about, but we're going to look at why, especially. But when you look at these sort of things, and we're going to do this morning together, and we have it prepared for you, is that instead of relying on our own potentially misleading impressions of human experience, because you and I know that when we look back at our lives, and you can think of this anytime there's an accident, there's a crime, you talk about the eyewitnesses, every one of them remembers it a little bit differently. It doesn't mean something didn't happen. It doesn't mean that there isn't a true way that things happen. But we can mix it up, and it helps to have something that is specific, that is real, that is tangible, and that we can actually look back to in order to reassure us of what's actually happened here. So maybe instead of relying on the misleading impression of our own human experience, we should trust in God's promises. Because God promises to be with us even in life's darkest hours. Even then. Just like we look to the porcelain cow, the stocking, the t-shirt, the sweater, my photos. Just as we look to those sort of things as our past events and reality, our own history, we can look to these things and look back, remembering and reflecting on God's past actions, who he is, what he's done, and enabling us to appreciate that faithfulness and trust it in the future. Remembering what God has done allows us to anticipate what God is going to do. He does not change. His character is the same. If he acted one way in the past, and our best way of knowing how he is going to act, and the character of God, is to look at Jesus. And if he acted that way then, he's going to act that way now, because his character doesn't change. His faithfulness does not fade away. So we move into the Apostle Paul, probably about 20 years later, and he's writing to a church in Corinth. And this is the passage that we use almost every single time that we do this, every month that we do communion. We look at this passage, and this is how it goes. And this is what the Apostle Paul was writing to the church. He said, "For I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night in which he was betrayed, took bread, and after he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same way, he also took the cup after supper, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this every time you drink it in remembrance of me.' Now listen to this. 'For every time you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes.'" You anticipate the future. You anticipate what God is doing in your life now and will continue to do. When you do this, Paul's saying, you look to the past and remember what God has done for you. You look to the future, to what God will continue to do in you and in our world. You celebrate what he's doing now because of what he did then. You trust him to do what he says he will do because of what he has done and is doing. When you do this, you celebrate real life and real hope. We're going to take our communion now. And Emmanuel, if you can just bring that stuff up there. If this is your first time here, this is sort of how we do it. We practice what we call as an open table here at City Church. All that means is, if you can say in your heart, "Jesus is Lord of my life," you're welcome to participate. We require nothing more than that, because if Jesus is Lord of your life, if Jesus is the central thing in your life, the filter through which you live, the filter through which you see the world, you're welcome to participate. We have bread over here. We have it cut up for reasons. If you don't understand, think about it for a moment. So you're not grabbing the bread, understand? But we also have gluten-free option, which has not been cut up apparently. We can break that off. And then Emmanuel has grape juice and wine. And you dip in whichever one of those is your preference, tradition, conscience, whichever one you'd like to do. And as you do, we'll have some music playing, and you come up and you take your piece and you dip it in there, and they'll have a blessing for you as you do. And just think about this for a second, as we've talked about today. 3,500 years of history, celebrating the faithfulness of God, celebrating what God has said he will do, what he has done, what he continues to do, and what he will do. Think about these things while you do this today, and let us give thanks and celebration for those things, for the faithfulness of God and the hope that we have because of that. Father, we thank you for the faithfulness that you have shown to us and all those who have gone before us. We thank you that you do not change, that we can trust in who you are and what you said you would do. Give us the courage and the boldness to actually lean into that and not be so worried about, I'm not sure, and try to control things ourselves and lean on our own understanding and our own ability to control situations, our own ability to look into the future and see what's best for us and how you're working in our lives. Give us the courage and the boldness to rely on you in a way that we never have before. And God, I pray for everybody here that every time we do this communion, Lord's Supper, Eucharist, whatever we want to call it, whenever we do this again, that we will look back and look forward and be in the present. And trust in you. For all these things we pray. In Jesus' name.